The sea had gone quiet years ago. Its waves, once full of secrets and whispered names, now sounded ordinary, like they belonged to someone else's memory. Heo Joon-jae used to stand there sometimes, where the water met the sand, trying to listen for her voice. But the ocean never spoke again. And maybe that was how it was meant to be, because some goodbyes aren't made of words. Some are made of waiting. For years, he carried her silence like a second heartbeat. The kind that reminds you you're alive, but never lets you forget what you've lost. He built a life, or something that looked like one, in Seoul. A small apartment near the Han River, curtains always half-closed, radio always humming songs from another time. He smiled when people asked about work. He laughed when they joked about love. But inside, every corner of him still looked toward the sea. Then one evening, the city breathed differently. It was late spring, when Seoul smells like rain and memory. He had just finished another day at the law office, tie loosened, mind heavy with cases that didn't matter. He stopped by a cafe near Hongdae, one of those quiet ones with wooden seats and the sound of espresso machines that mimic waves. He never noticed the woman at the corner table, not until the cup in her hand slipped and shattered. The sound wasn't loud, but it split something open. He turned, and there she was. Shim Cheong. Or someone who looked exactly like her. But not quite. Her hair was shorter now, her eyes steadier. The wildness of the sea that once shimmered in her gaze was replaced by something softer, calm, almost human. She blinked once, as if recognizing him was both impossible and inevitable. He froze. The cafe air thickened. Even time seemed to pause for the reunion it had been holding back for too long. Joon-jae, she whispered, not as a mermaid who once crossed centuries, but as a woman who'd finally found the ground beneath her feet. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His hands trembled around the cup he no longer held. Because after years of hearing her name only in dreams, he was terrified that saying it aloud might break the spell. The next few minutes felt like a memory walking backward. They Saturday. They stared. They laughed too soon and cried too late. No magic, no glowing pearls, no waves crashing in approval, just two people who'd loved each other once, now trying to remember how to breathe in the same air again. She told him her story, voice steady, eyes lost. She remembered waking up near the sea, cold and human, with only his face in her mind. The ocean had let her go, without explanation, without goodbye. She learned to walk again, to speak, to work. She lived quietly, selling paintings of waves she couldn't name. She said she came to Seoul because something in her heart had been tugging her here. I didn't know why, she whispered. Now I do. He wanted to tell her everything, how he never stopped waiting, how he'd searched the shorelines of every city he visited, how every drop of rain reminded him of her tears that once turned into pearls. But words felt too small. So he did what he'd always done best, he looked at her. And in that look, everything was said. They began again, slowly, carefully, like rebuilding a house from its ashes. She moved into the apartment across from his. It wasn't planned. The city just arranged itself that way, as if fate still had a quiet sense of humor. Their days were simple. Morning coffee, shared groceries, occasional laughter echoing through the hallway. She'd knock on his door with dishes she tried to cook. He'd tease her about the taste. Sometimes, they'd walk by the Han River at dusk, their reflections trembling on the water. The wind would brush against her hair, and he'd almost hear the sea again. But they both knew love doesn't return unchanged. It comes back scarred, quieter, but deeper. There were nights she'd wake up from dreams of drowning, shivering until dawn. He'd hold her then, whispering, "You're here. You're not in the sea anymore." Sometimes, he'd watch her stare at the bathtub like it was a memory she couldn't control. Other times, she'd find him tracing maps of coastlines he used to search. Love wasn't easy, but it was real. And maybe that was all they ever wanted. One day, she painted again. The first time since her return. It was of a man standing on a beach, holding a bottle filled with seawater, staring at it as though it carried the answer to everything. She hung it in her small studio. When he saw it, he smiled and said, "You always had a way of turning goodbye into art." She laughed, touching his face lightly. "And you always had a way of making me stay." They didn't need to define what they were anymore. The sea had taken their titles, mermaid, savior, lover, and replaced them with something simpler, human. And humans, they learned, fall in love not once, but in countless little ways. In burnt toast. In mismatched mugs. In shared silence. In the sound of rain hitting the glass when neither wants to move. Seoul became their ocean. The streets their tides. The night lights their stars. Sometimes, he'd find her at the window, staring at the moon as if waiting for it to whisper her name again. And sometimes, she'd catch him doing the same, gazing at the horizon as if afraid it might steal her again. But neither spoke of the past anymore. Because loving her now meant loving her here. He took her to meet his mother one spring. The same woman who once doubted every miracle now smiled as she watched them together. "You've changed," she told Joon-jae later. "How?" "You used to wait for happiness. Now you're living it." That night, he found Shim Cheong asleep on the couch, sunlight from the morning creeping across her face. He thought of the ocean, the curses, the centuries, and realized all of it had led to this quiet moment. No waves. No fate. Just love breathing, ordinary, alive. But love stories, even healed ones, never stop evolving. There came a day when she had to return not to the sea, but to the place where her memories began. A coastal village near Sokcho. She wanted to see it one last time, she said. "It feels like part of me still lives there." He went with her, of course. The journey was silent. When they arrived, the wind smelled like their past, salty, endless, familiar. She walked straight into the water, only ankle deep, and closed her eyes. "Do you miss it?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "I miss who I was with you. But she's gone. And that's okay." He reached for her hand. "She's not gone. She's here." And she smiled, the kind that dissolved every distance time had ever tried to build. They stood there for a long time, two silhouettes framed by the dying light, waves curling at their feet. The tide came and went, but for the first time, neither of them moved. Because maybe the sea didn't take her away, maybe it was just waiting for her to return stronger, to love without magic, without fear. Back in Seoul, they built a life like any other couple, filled with imperfections and beauty. She opened an art gallery, filled with paintings of the sea in every shade of memory. He left his law firm and started helping small communities near the coast. They didn't chase grand gestures anymore. Instead, they built love in small, unremarkable moments that meant everything. Her laughter became his sunrise. His quiet became her peace. Sometimes, they'd argue about forgotten groceries, about whose turn it was to do the dishes. And in those moments, they'd realize, this is what they always wanted, not eternity, not legend, but normalcy. Because love that survives forever isn't the one that fights time, it's the one that learns to live inside it. Years later, a journalist would write an article about them, the couple who met by the sea. No one knew the truth behind their story. No one knew that her first life began in water, and his began the moment he met her. They kept that secret like a prayer. Because some love stories are too sacred to be explained, they can only be felt. On the anniversary of their reunion, he surprised her with a painting of his own. It was clumsy, uneven, but full of heart. It showed two figures walking side by side on land, not the sea. She laughed through tears. "You're improving." He grinned. "You're the reason I learned." She kissed him then, softly, as the evening light poured in like liquid gold. Outside, the wind hummed like waves. Inside, time stood still not because of magic, but because of love. And maybe that's how legends truly end, not with storms or destinies fulfilled, but with quiet mornings, shared laughter, and the understanding that love doesn't need to defy nature to feel eternal. It just needs to stay. Heo Joon-jae once waited for the sea to bring her back. Now, he wakes beside her every day. And realizes the ocean did. Not as a miracle, but as life itself.